Hello and welcome to the Majlis, the podcast by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, your host here in Washington, D.C. The authoritarian tendencies and repression in Central Asia are increasingly pushing the handful of political opposition to escape the country to a safer destinations, albeit repression follows them even there. The dangerous places are Russia and Turkey, but Western European countries are not safe either. To assess this situation, a group of researchers have recently launched a project called Central Asian Political Exiles Database. Today on the Majlis, we are delighted to have experts behind the project to discuss what is that they want to achieve, what has been the achievement so far of the project, and some of the insights on what has prompted the launch of this initiative. So please welcome from UK Professor John Hedershaw, lecturer at the University of Exeter. Also from London, Marcy Wysherding, researcher at the Amnesty International. From Moscow, Russia, Natalia Gontsova, associate with the Civic Assistant Committee. And from Prague, Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog, Kishlak Owazi. Welcome on board, colleagues.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you. So, John, let's start with you. I was flagged about this initiative in its very early stages, I believe, a couple of years ago. I guess you just launched the second edition of the paper. So tell us, please, about the project and who are the people in the database and their stories.
This really has been going on now for 3 or 4 years, involving the research that some of us here at the University of Exeter and our colleague Alexander Cooley at Columbia University and other researchers have been working on, which is trying to sort of aggregate data and build up a fuller picture on Central Asian political exiles. So we're interested in people that, for a reason of a political kind, have been forced to flee their country. And more than that, they have stayed active in politics to some degree, or at least they've stayed of being of interest by their home governments, who have sought to track them and repress them overseas. So it's really about looking at how Central Asian politics has moved beyond the borders of Central Asia and how that continues to occur. But obviously that has, I think, also value for human rights purposes in terms of protecting the right to asylum for Central Asian refugees and being able to work with colleagues such as Maisie at Amnesty International and Natalia at the Civic Assistance Committee to look at the situation, to sometimes work collaboratively on advocacy issues where we see a specific issue, such as that with regards to the use of Interpol red notices, for example, and then also to collaborate on providing expert witness testimony and support to asylum applicants. So we started off with a kind of research and academic purpose, and as we've sort of worked more with partners in the world of NGOs and human rights activism, we've seen that there are advocacy purposes this too, and specific support services that we can provide to certain Central Asian political exiles who need that kind of support.
What's the background of people makes up the largest group in this database? It appears that the exiles are not only just the political figures, but also includes civic societies and press and other backgrounds.
Absolutely. They're people who've been targeted politically, so they may not identify themselves as political exiles. We started off with 4 types, and we've added a 5th for this second edition of the database. So the types are former regime insiders and family members. They're some of the sort of notorious figures of the type of Mukhtar Ablyazov, Maxim Bakiev, who have quite possibly been involved in politics at the highest level, and they have subsequently been targeted by the new governments, or the current government now considers them to be an enemy, often for quite legitimate reasons. We don't make any judgments on the rightfulness or wrongfulness of these cases. And then other categories are opposition parties and movements. Thirdly, banned clerics and those who have been labelled as religious extremists by their home governments. A 4th category includes independent journalists, academics, and civil society activists. And then finally, we've added businessmen and relatives of political exiles who themselves have been targeted, even though they may not consider themselves to be at all political, but they've been targeted. And what's interesting is that when we look at different Central Asian countries, we find different patterns. So for Uzbekistan, for example, there's a very large number of banned clerics and alleged religious extremists. For Tajikistan, it's much more opposition party figures. And for Turkmenistan, it's a mix of media and civil society, opposition, former insiders. So it really reflects the different kinds of exile communities you have across those different countries. And it also, I think, reflects the trajectory of those politics and the causes behind movement of groups into exile. So, for example, in Uzbekistan, it is the Andijan massacre of 2005 that has really shaped a great deal of the exile politics that we've seen since 2005.
Wow, interesting. Maybe we could bring Talia or Macy here. So anything strikes out in this finding or what John has been talking about in terms of the background of these exiles? Macy, let's start with you.
I think what we've noticed ever increasingly, the governments in the region and also the security services, they are resorting to counterterrorism legislation and charging people with, having caused national security risk, committed national security offenses, being extremists, and it basically makes everyone extremely vulnerable. It also ups the risk for anyone who's associated with someone who has been charged with, counterterrorism, their families, for example. So it also, for all of us, it immediately increases, the level of the burden of proof that we need to provide. Yeah, and it's much more difficult to conduct advocacy on behalf of these people with foreign governments.
Natalia, from your perspective, the people in the database and the tendencies and the level of repression, what's your thought on this?
What struck me the most? Well, actually, that's quite obvious for us because we deal with those people on the everyday basis. And what's interesting about this database is that it really looks into their movement from one place to another. And at some point in the website, you can even see the maps, like which countries and did they go and why they were moving. And it's usually because they were persecuted in the new country of their residency or like where they were staying. And what's interesting here is the level of cooperation between different countries, especially between police forces and other security forces of different countries, especially in their post-Soviet countries. Like Russian security forces cooperate very closely with security forces in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other countries. Of course, they do not announce that out loud, but using evidence and witnesses that have been moved from Russia back to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, like forcefully returned, we can say that it is almost proven that those countries cooperate. And also that, it also highlights the importance of working with Interpol for human rights organizations, because very often when the search is posted by one country, it's sometimes, even if the person is unjustly searched by his government, the red notice is still there. And it's impossible for this person to move from country to country because he or she will be arrested.
That's a very interesting topic that we would like to talk about a little bit later. But before that, Bruce, I wanted to take your thought on something else. So looking into some of the graphics that I was received earlier, a little bit on this topic, it seems that the level of escape and repression are not even. There are some ups and downs when compared to various years. Talk about the trend a little bit.
Well, I suppose there's all kinds of different reasons for this. The one that would hit me first would be how vulnerable some of these governments feel at certain times. Certainly, these exiles are saying things that are not complimentary about the government in the countries that they came from. Now, if you're confident in your position within the country, then you can kind of ignore these things for a while. But these countries have to interact with other countries around the world, and of course they're all looking for foreign investment, and so there was some time when they particularly felt vulnerable, or there was a need to mute to the greatest extent possible any criticism of how they are running the country, then these would be times when you would press a little bit harder on some of these people. And of course, there are times when some of these exiles make sensational statements if they really are politically active. And they're revealing things about the government that, of course, they would rather not have revealed. So, in cases like that's when you would see a spike all of a sudden to try to keep this information from becoming public knowledge in the international sphere. But again, it kind of changes from government to government. One thing I've noticed is that the Tajik government, for whatever reason, this just seems to be a constant policy with them lately. They just don't let up on this at all. We've seen it with Group 24 earlier this year in Turkey, and it just seems like it's relentless. Even, these people, I know you saw, Mohammed, today that they returned 4 people from Afghanistan. The Afghan government had extradited them back to Tajikistan. Supposedly they were, members of this group of General Nazarzadeh who allegedly was trying to overthrow the government, but we don't know exactly who these 4 people are, and chances are we will never find out exactly why they were detained in Afghanistan and sent back. But given the Tajik government's track record, I would say that there was some serious doubt about, are these people even connected to that or not? Or is there something totally different that another reason that the Tajik government wants them back and locked up in Tajikistan?
Yeah. The other factor is that Afghanistan is also working with Tajikistan on this topic. So, definitely we are going to come back to the reasoning of this, John. First, let's nail down a little bit number-related questions in the database. So, how are the numbers of exiles compared as per their countries of origin in the database?
I mean, it's important to say that the absolute numbers themselves, they're large and increasing, but they really tell us the tip of the iceberg. So we think they are reasonably representative of the broader pattern. So it's the proportions that I think are interesting. I mean, maybe first just to go back to this question of the inconsistency over time and what that means. And for me, it's much less about perceived vulnerability and perhaps more about specific campaigns against exile groups launched, possibly in response to an incident where the government has felt threatened. So clearly there was a crackdown after Andijan. In the Tajik government case, I think it's much more a choice going back to around 2010 to 2012 to target certain opposition groups, the new Group 24 and the older Islamic Revival Party of Tajikistan, and then to pursue them relentlessly. And something similar happened much earlier in Turkmenistan when its independent media folk and opposition people, such as they were moving to Russia and then were trapped there. So these are specific strategies being used by the security services. That's what this data reflects. But to get to that question of the overall sort of proportions and figures, around about 3/4 of all entries in our database are from Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. So now we've got better historical data, so we really know the extent of the crackdown in Uzbekistan. We've got 120 named individual cases from Uzbekistan. There are many, many more than that. They're just the ones that are out there in the public domain and that we can document. The intense period for those was around about 2005-06, straight after Andijan through to 2010-11. That was the intense period. In recent years, it's Tajikistan, particularly around 2015, when both the campaigns against Group 24 and the Islamic Revival Party of Tajikistan were at their height.
Yeah, it looks like in terms of numbers, Uzbekistan is a little bit higher. It also reflects, I believe, the population of the country, correct?
Yes, possibly, and the extensiveness of, larger numbers of people who've fled.
Just a side note on that, John, since some changes are taking place in Uzbekistan lately after the change of the government, do you see some change in the tendencies, in the number of figures that are coming out of the country?
Yeah, the data we have, and it's relatively smaller numbers now, but it seems to be representative. But, since about 2012-13, there's been a drop-off in the number of political exiles being targeted. So even prior to the end of Karimov's time. Now, that might be sort of cyclical, that they simply had attacked so many Uzbek figures, they'd imprisoned so many, they'd returned or disappeared, or in some cases even assassinated so many up to that point already. But certainly the data over the period since Mirziyoyev came to power, it doesn't show anything like a new spike where Mirziyoyev has gone after those overseas. That's not the case. So it's too early to say really what the broader Uzbek position towards its Romanian exiles is. But at the moment, certainly it doesn't look like there's an extra move of further repression. So yeah, our data does show that. It does show very much Tajikistan overtaking Uzbekistan as the sort of most persistent user of extraterritorial security measures against its exiles overseas.
John, you also mentioned that little bit earlier that it might not be the complete list of the exiled people at all. So I think a couple of days ago, Bruce, you did a story based on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Turkmen services reporting on the fate of a Turkmen student in Turkey who was called back and jailed for 20 years. I'm still not sure about the reason as to why he was jailed, whether because he spoke to Radio Free Europe or created the Society of Turkmen Students in Turkey. I'm just not sure about that. So anyhow, what I was trying to say is that in the extent that Central Asian regimes could go to repress its people, and not all of them are reported, especially cases that has to do with Turkmenistan. Bruce, do you want to say something about that students particularly?
I mean, that was just sheer trickery on the part of the government to try to lure him back. And we know that there's a campaign, for lack of a better word, to bring Turkmen nationals working abroad back home. The motivation for that is still unclear, as unclear as what the charges are against this particular student that you were mentioning. Whether Turkmen government's credibility is so low, or whether they just haven't felt the need. They haven't. I don't. John would know better, or any of our guests would know better how many red notices they have out now. But I don't think it's very many. That's, like I said, in the case of the student, that just seems to be they tricked him. Into coming home. So.
Yeah. Anyhow, thank you for the insight in this horrible trouble practice. So we will continue Majlis discussing methods of repression and its extension beyond the borders of Central Asia shortly. Let me recap the discussion here today in the light of the launch of the second edition of the Central Asian Exiles database by the Exeter University and its partners. We are discussing how Central Asian dissidents are forced to escape their countries and how the repression follows them even in exile. Joining me in the discussion are Professor John Hedershaw, lecturer at the University of Exeter, Maisi Weisherding, researcher at the Amnesty International, Natalia Gontsova, associate with the Civic Assistance Committee, and Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia blog. Shlak Awazi, welcome back, colleagues. So let's take a look in the forms of repression that we have been talking a little bit earlier about that. As per your assessment, John, what constitutes repression as per the assessment, and what are the forms that Central Asian regimes are applying, and how these tactics are evolving over the past couple of years?
We distinguish between three stages of repression. We call it the extraterritorial security process. First, a home government might put an exile on notice, and that might include formal measures of issuing some kind of arrest warrant or using an Interpol red notice, which is not quite the same thing. It's kind of like a wanted poster, but might also include informal measures like threats to family members and defamation campaigns in the media. But one thing we're really noticing a lot of is this collective punishment of relatives. So I'm sure Maisie and Natalia can talk more about that because it's very, very common. And then we move through two other stages: arrest and detention at the second stage, and at the third stage, extradition or disappearance or assassination attempt, but broadly what we call a sort of end game against the political exile. And the important thing across all three of these stages is there's formal and informal processes, and they're not just in parallel, but they work with one another. So the collective punishment which is used against relatives is really, really important part of putting an exile formally on notice. Equally, dispossessing an exile of their assets and perhaps arresting a relative at home is important in the attempt to sort of detain an exile overseas, and so have pressure both at home and abroad. And that's why it's transnational, that's why it crosses borders. And we see a lot of this informal cooperation between security services at level 3, where disappearances occur, or renditions we might call them. Particularly we've seen that from Russia. Natalia hinted at that earlier. So the new things, the new kinds of practices that I think we're becoming more aware of, and again, Maisie and Natalia could speak about this much more, are things like this collective punishment of relatives. It's been becoming much more apparent, I think. Also, the digital surveillance and harassment mechanisms. It seems like some Central Asian states are becoming more effective at that the security services are able to come to them through their internet browsing and threaten them in that way.
Natalia or Macy, whoever wants to jump in here, your thoughts on the forms of repression and the way in which these tactics are applied in Central Asia. Macy, let's start with you.
I wouldn't necessarily call the strategy, the tactics and the methods new. I think they have always been used. As you know, certainly I remember that we documented persecution of relatives back in the 1990s, but also what we saw in the 1990s was the local mahallas, for example, calling everyone for a meeting and then publicly humiliating, either human rights defenders or anyone who was accused, so it's almost like there's a revival of that. So I think over the years, they've just basically learned the methods that are most effective, and certainly targeting your family, using sexual violence, threats of sexual violence against your female relatives, but also your male relatives, especially against elderly relatives like mothers or grandmothers or daughters, young nieces, cousins, is extremely effective. The stigma attached to sexual violence in these Central Asian, predominantly Muslim countries, the trauma from using those methods, they're really kind of terrible. And, that's what we have found. And so many people will actually, not even talk about it. And that makes it really difficult for them to actually get the protection that they need. And potentially they could be sent back to the country. So I think that's something that is very worrisome, the increasing use of this.
Let's take Natalia's thoughts on this. Natalia, your NGO, as the name says, Civic Assistance Committee, is mandated to support exiles. Take us through your experience of helping them when they are already in exile.
Exactly. I work at an NGO that works with migrants and refugees in Moscow, Russia. So my experience with people from Central Asia is mostly what happens to them in Russia. And I just wanted to note some persecution of relatives and persecution of people when government claims that committed some religious or extremist crimes. Russia is a country of immigration, and we have a lot of people from Central Asia working here as labor migrants. And many of them are already in Russia, either fleeing Central Asian countries or just here in even know that they are being searched for in their home countries, and they only find out about that when they are stopped for checking the documents, and then suddenly the Russian police forces, they find out that this person is an international search, and that's when they realize that, well, actually they are wanted back home. Well, not all of them, but we noticed that tendency. Another thing is that I can only talk about, so to say, persecutions of those people in Russia. And I would say that it's not really, like most of those types of persecutions are not really directed at people from Central Asia per se, but they just, fall into the categories, when they fall into the categories of asylum seekers or refugees. And the Russian asylum policy is very poorly structured and poorly executed. Like, just to give you an example, in 2017, total amount of people who were enjoyed the refugee status, like from Tajikistan, was 7 people, from Uzbekistan 19. Just for comparison, Syrians, there were 2 people who were enjoying the refugee status in Russia. So it shows huge problems applying, difficulties when you're applying for the refugee status, difficulties when you appeal the wrong decisions, and that, again, it's not directed specifically to the people from Central Asia, but they just fall into that. And illegal deportations, illegal returns, forceful returns are also very much exercised here. And just to add to what I was saying in the beginning, like we found that mostly Uzbekistan and Tajikistan governments are collaborating with Russian security forces to forcefully on people, even if we had cases that, for example, European Court of Human Rights said that the person cannot be returned until the fair trial or until the trial in the human rights courts, but the person was returned back forcefully. So, these are the things that are happening to people when they are already outside their countries. For example, in Russia. Unfortunately, I cannot speak about other countries of asylum.
Sure. Just sticking with Russia, Natalia. So you mentioned the cooperation between security forces between Russia and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Is it a low-level cooperation, or these things are happening with the blessing of the leadership, the top leadership?
We don't really know. Like it's not public information. From what we hear and from what we observe, it's mostly like money issue, a sort of money involved. Obviously, that wouldn't be happening without the blessing from the high authorities.
So
but very often those.
You said money. What type of money is that?
We don't know how much, but we just heard from people who were forcefully returned that like a person would talk on the phone saying, well, I have already gave all my money, but they, meaning like, Russian police, are not giving him to me or like not giving him to her. Like I need to find more to give it to them. So we don't really know about how much money we're talking about. It's just, and it's probably just a heritage, a legacy from the Soviet Union when those police forces worked together, and they, some links are still there, and they speak the same language, they've been through that together, so to say. They understand each other's problems, and maybe that's why it was just easier for them to cooperate on that than so to say, cross with the partners from other countries.
So Macy, as nasty as it is, you understand why in how these cases of repression might be happening within the region, even beyond the border, especially in the type of challenges that they are facing in Turkey and Russia. But how can it be happening in Western democracy?
Well, I think you have networks in these countries as well in the West. I mean, all the Uzbekistani embassies used to have their kind of SNB officers posted. They say that they don't have them now anymore. I don't know, but so you have a really good network of security forces who monitor the exiles, not just the exiles, but anyone really, their citizens who live abroad in our country, who study or are on business trips. They, I would say, like all security forces the world over, they compile dossiers on everyone. And whenever they feel the need, they will look at the dossier, and then they will start using anything that they think they can use to put pressure on the individual, mostly related to their families or maybe something they've done in the past. I think one of my colleagues wrote a report about surveillance of exiles from Uzbekistan, and we certainly found that the Uzbekistani security services are very adept at conducting surveillance and, of the movements of all the exiles and actually threatening them, both online and over the phone. So those are all practices. And I think basically security services in the West are very often doing the same thing. So we have big international telecoms companies who very often, basically supply the technology to do this, and sometimes even training.
Yeah, Macy, whenever some tragedy takes place, either in the form of some big political exiled name is returned or killed in the Western countries or arrested, when you confront the authorities in the West about that, how they explain this?
I could take one of the cases that worked on, for example, is Mirsabir Hamidkariev from Uzbekistan, who's a filmmaker, businessman, entrepreneur. He was forcibly deported from Russia. Well, he was abducted with the collusion of the Russian security forces And it was very interesting because, this was raised by the European Court of Human Rights and by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe with Russia. And basically, Russia just took the version given to them by their Uzbekistani colleagues, accepted their diplomatic assurances and said that, in fact, he had traveled by himself all the way to Uzbekistan within, I think it was like little more than 13 hours all the way from Moscow. And whereas everyone knew, and there was video footage of him actually being abducted in Moscow, being taken to the airport, being put on a plane and sent home. And yet the official kind of version is, oh no, he just, got into a car and drove all the way, even though it's completely absurd and you can't do it physically. So that tends to be the response, is basically denial and saying that, you're making up this story, you're actually, you're listening to an extremist or something, and you have a particular narrative which is anti-Russian, anti-Uzbek, and, we believe our, counterparts in Uzbekistan.
Very interesting. It was also raised a little bit earlier, I believe, John, you were the one pointing at this. Aside from these authorities in Russia and Turkey, and also some Western countries, there are also some other enablers in the form of institutions, various institutions. Interpol was one of the institutions was mentioned. Talk us about the role of those institutions, John, if you can.
Well, the Interpol case has been increasingly documented, but it hasn't really been resolved. We know Interpol now have rules to say that if you're a refugee, then you will not have a red notice against you, and it can be taken down, it can be challenged and then removed. But as I pointed to earlier, there is this process of diffusion where things just, red notices that have appeared or names that have gone into data sets tend to stick there, and it's hard to get them removed once they're there, and your name stays out there in kind of cyberspace in one way or another, or certainly on a national police database, and you get stopped. So I think what's important here in terms of your earlier question about how does this spread to Western European democracies is that it is the lack of vigilance about maintaining human rights commitments and the right to asylum in Western Europe that is making Central Asian individuals feel more vulnerable. Central Asian political exiles, so that when they're faced with significant online harassment, when they're faced with the collective punishment of their relatives overseas, and also their own vulnerability, they have to make decisions about what to do, even sometimes whether to just accept their return and their incarceration back home in their country to end this form of transnational repression that they're subject to and that very much their relatives are subject to back home. So I think the way that it spreads to the European Union states in particular is because of the erosion of the right to asylum in those countries. So Natalia talked earlier about the problem in Russia of very few people being accepted with refugee status, but we know that the rate of granting of asylum in Poland to Tajik refugees, many of whom have very, very strong grounds for claiming asylum, but there's a very low rate of acceptance of full refugee status for that. So we see that within the European Union. We see cases in Germany even of members of the Islamic Revival Party of Tajikistan being refused asylum. Fortunately, there are appeal processes, so people aren't being immediately deported. But there's this erosion of the right to asylum. And it even occurs in smaller things like visas being refused for certain individuals, so they're not having freedom of movement and things when they want to travel, even though they've got full refugee status. So there's this sense of vulnerability for political exiles and this sense of the erosion of the right to asylum. And I would say that is linked to the more serious incidences where, alongside this erosion of the right to asylum, it seems that, there is some evidence emerging of, the greater activity of Central Asian security services within the European Union to track and target and possibly threaten with attack, physical attack, some high-level Central Asian political exiles.
Yeah, that was very clear in the form of the Turkmen student who was taken back from Turkey to Turkmenistan and jailed for 20 years. John, I just wanted to dig a little bit deep into the role of Interpol. We have been talking about this for some time now. So what is that they don't get about Central Asia?
They do have a system of checking now red notices, but it's just that the volume is huge. It's a very technocratic process, and it's important to understand Interpol is a bureaucratic organization. It processes information. It is not a large international policing service. It has minimal capacity. I'm not really expressing sympathy for them, but just demonstrating that we shouldn't assume they have some great central capacity. They need to be more active. They need to sharpen up their processes. They may need a system of identifying real problem countries. So countries like Tajikistan that have been putting very large numbers of people onto the Interpol Red Notice system. And in the past, Interpol has accepted that. So they need to see the problem with serial offenders, I think. Countries like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan who have used and abused their Red Notice system extensively. So there is an attempt to communicate with Interpol, but as I say, it's a bureaucracy. It's not a nimble organization.
Mm-hmm. We also have to conclude the discussion with just final notes here. In the situation like this, the Central Asian security forces are more active, not only in Russia, in Turkey, and even some of the European Union countries. And Interpol is not really, at least so far, is not performing in a way the expectations are. So what can be done about it?
This is a very profound question. From our part here in our Civic Assistance Committee, we are working on asylum system. We are trying to make the government accountable for what's happening with asylum seekers, why their asylum system is not working, why appeals for refugee status are not accepted. We are trying to raise awareness of what is going on, of their all the forceful returns that are happening. And I think it is with NGOs, it's their constant and recurrent issue. And I think that their situation, at least in Russia, the situation with political exiles from Central Asia falls neatly into all the migration issues. Like in Russia, migration issues are not really important, and their reason behind not accepting refugees, not providing them with a status, is that we don't want to happen to us what happened to Europe. That is the main message. Even though people kind of understand that nothing that of serious happened to Europe, but the Russian government, the Russian authorities, the Russian national state TV, they're hinting at the fact that Europe was, swamped with refugees, with all those people who are now called terrorists, just because they're from those countries. And I think that from our point of view, what we can do is just bring in a lot of attention to those issues, informing general population about the problem, and just making migration issues not an issue anymore, so to say. Just showing it's a natural, normal, and actually non-problematic thing in certain ways.
So, Macy, just a final point from you. So, in a situation like this, is there anything those exiles can do to avoid or escape the increasing challenge, the type of challenge that we were talking about today?
That's another very difficult question. Well, I think they are in an extremely difficult position just because, like I said before, this overuse of counterterrorism, legislation, charges of demonization, generally of migrants or exiles, asylum seekers by, like Natalia said, just they become, the narrative is that they're all kind of a danger. They are either terrorists or they are scroungers, people who just want to come and take our jobs. I think what is really important is for them as well to everywhere emphasize that they have the same rights as everyone else. And more I find myself, having to repeat to everyone that human rights are actually universal and those are our rights, So these people actually here do have a right to be given international protection, because if you send them back, they run a real risk of torture. And actually, the ban on torture is absolute. So no one, absolutely no one should be subjected to torture. And I think that's also something where they have to become maybe a little bit more assertive as well, to kind of just state their rights. But I know that that's extremely difficult. And I think that's our role to basically to raise awareness, to facilitate access to decision makers, and to basically come up with a counter narrative that says these people are not terrorists, they're not scroungers, they are people just like us, and they enjoy the same universal rights as us.
Okay, just the final notes. John, the database is really useful in many ways, in many forms, as you also mentioned some of them. So what is your recommendation involving the type of challenge that you want to highlight in this database?
I think the main purpose for us is to link what goes on within a country to what is going on with the exile overseas beyond the borders of that country, and to show how these two things are very much linked. So we've been good at tracking, I think, human rights organizations do their very best to track repression and incarceration and the violation of human rights within countries, and increasingly overseas too. But we want to show how these two things are linked together in a transnational way. And that then, I think, then highlights the importance of countries that claim to be democracies and claim to allow the right to refuge and asylum, to protect that properly. So even when they are fully granting asylum to those who have a legitimate claim, and they don't always today, that seems to be eroded, they also then need to protect that more fully, I think, by providing support to individuals who are suffering from cyber harassment, by providing support to individuals whose relatives back home are suffering harassment, by making statements, and by engaging diplomatically with their former home country to try and prevent that from happening, and by being very active with those governments in pressuring them to indicate to them that they know very well what they're doing, that they're aware of their transnational activities, and that they consider these transnational activities to be violations in a way of their sovereignty. So I think there is a security agenda here for governments that are becoming more and more susceptible to this kind of use of extraterritorial security measures, particularly at these sort of lower levels. And then, of course, for governments that are extensively collaborating, then we just need to expose them. In the cases of Russia, I think that's really important, as Natalia said.
Okay, so Bruce, first your thoughts on what you heard from our guests on this challenge, and also, is there anything anyone can do to avert this challenge, this trend?
Well, the database that Exeter University is compiling, I think, is a fantastic contribution to this. I would hope that the people at Interpol and any other law enforcement agencies in other countries would, if they take someone into custody based on a request for detention from another country, that they would take the time to look at something like that. I'm surprised they don't have that themselves. And clearly, there's got to be some governments that are, as John mentioned, are suspect. That they've issued a lot of these kind of warrants before. Many of them ended up being without any kind of basis, and that should be a signal to law enforcement agencies around the world, international or within a country, that you're going to have to take a little bit more time and look at this before you decide that you're going to detain someone, and certainly before you decide that you're going to extradite them back to their home country.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bruce Pannier, editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia blog, Kishlak Awazi. And also big thanks goes to Professor John Hedershah, lecturer at the University of Exeter, Macy Wiesherding, researcher at the Amnesty International, and Natalia Gontsuba, associate with the Civic Assistant Committee. Thank you very much for your time, colleagues.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was very nice to have you. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Central Asia podcast. Until next week. Bye-bye.